I'm very happy today to be having a conversation with Rabbi Patricia Karlin Neumann. We're going to be talking about love, of course, agape love, and we're going to be talking about it in the context of Judaism. And so I'd love to hear your definition of love from that point of view, and how love is expressed in the traditions of Judaism and by Jewish people.
So I think love is an emotion, a commitment, and a conviction manifest in action and devotion. So let me parse that. An emotion, overflowing concern, respect, and generosity toward another, a person, the divine, the earth, a tradition, a community. Commitment, emotion that's not backed up by action, is thin. I'm going to be meeting with a wedding couple after we meet, and I'll explain to them that the Jewish wedding has two parts to it: erusin, or betrothal, and nisuin, carrying off, the love part. So betrothal becomes the container for the relationship, a commitment to be there for one another, even in moments when it is inconvenient or difficult, or one doesn't feel all that generous toward one another. So I think the notion of having a container, of helping people to understand that love is not only that upswell of feeling, but is a dedication and a devotion to maintain a covenant, which is a central concept within Judaism, is very much part of how within Jewish tradition we see that most essential of emotional attachments of love. Conviction, a tradition of obligation or mitzvot. Sometimes people think of the word mitzvah or mitzvah and assume it means good deed. And indeed, there are many good deeds that come out of mitzvot, but it actually means obligation or responsibility. And the responsibility that I think of when I think of love is v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. There's a wonderful story that Yale law professor Stephen Carter tells of being a young black boy when his family moved to a predominantly white suburb. And he and his brothers were sitting on the steps thinking, I know we don't belong here. I know this was a mistake. I know we shouldn't be here. And there was a next door neighbor who happened to see these young black boys, waved at them, went inside her house, came back out with cream cheese sandwiches, and said, welcome to the neighborhood. And Stephen Carter talks about how that act of civility, that gesture of neighborliness and generosity stayed with him. The taste of that sandwich became for him the expression of love and welcome. And what he later learned is that that woman, Sarah Kestenbaum, was an Orthodox Jew. So she was literally manifesting love your neighbor as yourself by welcoming this family who felt that there would be questions about their presence. So that has always been a kind of powerful manifestation of loving your neighbor. Within the traditional sources, there are commentators that will parse what love your neighbor as yourself means. Two who are probably the most well-known medieval commentators are Maimonides and Nachmanides. Maimonides' interpretation of how one loves one's neighbor, because he asks, how do you turn this emotion into action, is to imitate God. Just as God clothed the naked, so human beings clothe the naked. We fulfill our obligations through actions. And there's a text which talks about these are things without measure, and their reward too is without measure. And so many of those actions are actions that are not quantifiable, but together become a manifestation of love. Nachmanides focuses on attitude. He notes that the quote, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, has a kind of odd grammatical presence, where instead of saying, "V'ahavta et reacha," you shall love the symbol of the indirect object, your neighbor. He focuses on the fact it says you shall extend love to your neighbor. So what does it mean to extend love to your neighbor? And he's less concerned with obligation and more concerned with motivation. So he talks about the way in which one manifests love is to hope for them the same things you hope for yourself. So just as you want to be able to have dignity, you offer dignity to someone else. Just as you want to be able to have security, you offer security to another. So in his sense of loving one's neighbor as oneself, it's about reconsidering your attitude. And that becomes much more doable, I think, than our reaction to how do I love people that I don't like?
Yeah.
But if you think about it in terms of offering someone the qualities of human dignity and the qualities of human autonomy and security and purpose, the things that we want for ourselves, it makes a lot of sense to want that for someone else. And then it reflects a society in which people treat one another with respect and caring and compassion and commitment. Societies and communities can be holy, but not simply for their own sake, but as a manifestation of the potential for holiness in each of us and in our traditions. And there's this lovely quote from Len Goodman on love and the ethical. In calling us to perfection and emulation of God's holiness, the Torah asks us not to do the impossible, to become infinite or disembodied, but to perfect our humanity, which Scripture calls God's image. This we do by seeking out and cultivating what is best in ourselves, morally, spiritually, intellectually, socially, artistically, and indeed physically, since our embodiment and that of others is the locus of that image, the silvered glass in which God's face shines. You know from the text that I offer in the class, there's a rabbi named Margaret Holub who has been for many years engaged in social justice. And she had had the experiences that many of us do of being engaged in social justice out of outrage and anger, and noted that sometimes that fuel burns low and it's hard to sustain it. But she talks about the fuel for social justice being what she calls nefesh chaya, which literally means the animal soul. It's the kind of the life force that makes for the energy to set the world right. And it's about reaffirming and insisting upon creation. So if we have the opportunity to experience, as we do today, a gorgeous day with the sun shining, where at least for some period of time we might feel that we don't have cares, that we want for other people to have that opportunity. And so she talks about that as the manifestation of love, encouraging us to engage in social change. And again, I think that that's, it replenishes itself, it renews itself in a way that outrage and anger often don't.
I'm interested in where these ideas came from, the almost rules on about how to behave. They seem almost to be a kind of guide to a stable society, as opposed to just a way of two people relating to each other. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yes, that's very much the case. And the text that I mentioned, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, which of course is probably the best known biblical manifestation of love. comes from a text called Kedoshim, the Holiness Code, and it's smack in the middle of the Bible, smack in the middle of the 5 books. It's right in the center of Leviticus. And that Holiness Code is an elaboration of what it means to create a society. And there are a number of different places where within the Holiness Code where love is addressed. One is you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The other is that you shall love the stranger. And that section begins, Kedoshim tiyu ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohecha. You shall be holy, for I, the eternal, your God, am holy. So embedded in a litany of how to live ethically, and there's a whole spectrum from honoring parents to leaving corners of the field and gleanings for the poor, to refrain from placing a stumbling block before the blind. And the tradition interprets that as before one who is blind in any matter, to reproving those who are unjust. And then it says, you shall love your neighbors yourself, I am the eternal. And you shall love the stranger as yourself, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt, I am the eternal. So within that description of how one is to be holy are a whole series of rules and reflections on how we treat one another, how we create community, how we create society.
You know, this idea of love thy neighbor has expanded from Judaism through Christianity and Islam, with almost the same words being used for that rule, that guide. And I wonder if you would comment briefly on the current action by Muslims to raise money to repair some of the cemeteries.
And there have been Muslim veterans who have offered to stand guard at Jewish cemeteries.
Really?
And that for me is that it bespeaks not just a recognition that we share common texts and that we understand our obligations in similar ways, but it also is, in my mind, one of the best reflections of who we can be as Americans. And I think in a moment when there's so much contention for what American values look like, I think that those relationships and those outstretched arms toward each other's community has been very, very essential. And of course, the counterpart is that when the refugee ban was first announced, there was, with one voice, the Jewish community standing up and saying, not only our tradition, but our history and experience makes clear that this is something that cannot stand. And we stand with our Muslim brothers and sisters who are being regarded as suspicious. And of course, in that specific experience, there was the history of the St. Louis, a ship that sailed from Germany that came to Miami and was turned away. And so all of the people who were on the ship returned to Germany, and most of them lost their lives in the Holocaust. So there's a very present and very real recognition that in Proverbs, just as face answers to face, so in the heart of human to human. And here's a manifestation where we recognize the face of our brother. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you speak of the dark times and how Jewish people have come through, and how the traditional texts have in fact encouraged Jews to survive?
Yeah, I think that question of how one maintains a sense of resilience, a sense of optimism, a sense of hopefulness in a dark time, one of the virtues or silver linings, I suppose, of having had a long history of oppression is you have to have some way of being able to believe in the future. And there are a number of different thoughts I have. One is Viktor Frankl's work on Man's Search for Meaning is an attempt to articulate how one can maintain being hopeful. The other is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was himself a survivor of the Holocaust, talks about being an optimist against his better judgment. And then the other is a rabbinic text that during the time of oppression in Egypt, when the Israelites were building the Pharaoh's pyramids, there were women who brought apples to their spouses and made love under the apple trees as a way of believing in the future. And so they're regarded as having had this special spark of holiness because they believed that there could be a future. And I think we all know that every time we bring a child into the world, it's with boundless hope that their lives will be better than our own. And so I think having had some significant moments of darkness within Jewish tradition, there's such an explosion of happiness and joy and appreciation in the welcoming of a new child, because it's an affirmation that there will be a future and it will be better.
Thank you very, very much for visiting with us today.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. Thank you.